Welcome back, everyone. We were last talking about Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the rise of Jim Crow segregation. Now we're going to talk a bit about progressivism in the context of both the U.S. and the South. Now, before I begin, it's worth noting that, sort of like populism, the term progressive is thrown around quite a good bit in contemporary political discourse. Once again, it should go without saying that the progressives we'll be talking about this week are quite different in their priorities than, say, people who call themselves progressives today. But all of this begs the question, who were the progressives? What was progressivism? In the case of the progressives, they were typically middle-class reformers, people who looked at the Gilded Age, or this period in the late 19th century that was defined by both rapid industrialization and high political corruption, and thought this society could run a lot more smoothly. And the way in which progressives tried to do this was through a mixture of traditional lobbying campaigns, political reforms, and also through exposés. In fact, if you recall lynching, the Mississippi-born journalist Ida B. Wells was actually a progressive herself. She was, in some ways, one of the muckrakers, as they were called, who would document the social ills of the Gilded Age and publish them in order to not only horrify the American public, but also really agitate for reforms. Now, progressivism, it should go without saying, varied in terms of its interest. There were progressives who focused exclusively on single issues like public education, prohibition, political reform, etc. And there were progressives who sort of saw a broader movement. In fact, really one of the very few progressives to fit this mold is Theodore Roosevelt, whom we'll talk about a little bit more in the next lecture. That said, progressives also favored some more nefarious things, as we'll talk about in the case of James K. Vardaman. But the key way to understand progressives in the South and progressives overall is really as reformers. They're not revolutionaries. They're not in favor of overturning and replacing the entire American socioeconomic system. They are for reforming it and no more. Now, with that said, that's not to say that they would not have achievements. It is, however, to say that they were quite limited in their perspective and in their ambitions. Now, in the case of the South, progressivism can really be understood as existing in two distinct forms. Progressivism that was imposed upon the South from outside, that would largely be resisted, and progressivism that emerged from the New South itself and responded directly to either national progressive causes or the externalities of the New South and its relative poverty and continued dependence on cheap labor and the problems that resulted from that dependence. Now, in terms of public health reform, a lot of New South public health issues would see progressive interventions by outsiders, not so much by insiders. This was very much the case with efforts to combat the hookworm infections and pellagra outbreaks that affected the region. Now, in the case of both of these maladies, it's well worth noting that they really were more reflective of the poverty and wealth inequality that continued to define life in the South well after the Civil War. And in the case of hookworm, its discovery actually surprised a great many Southerners who oftentimes dismissed hookworm as a disease itself. Now, hookworm was a parasitical infection that was discovered by the Dr. Charles Ward Stiles, who was financed by the oil baron John D. Rockefeller, who at this point was trying to sort of garner better publicity for himself because Rockefeller was being attacked by muckrakers who opposed his monopolies and his practices. And of course, his way of doing that was through philanthropy, something that one of his contemporaries and also one of the fellow titans of industry, Andrew Carnegie, advanced. Now, the discovery of hookworm surprised a lot of Southerners because really they did not think that it was a thing, that it was actually a disease. Now, it's mainly because the symptoms of hookworm are things like lethargy and digestive issues and things that, for the most part, Southerners either believed or were willing to believe were more pathologies of poor whites and poor blacks rather than any sort of disease or parasite. Now, in the case of efforts to fight hookworm and sort of eradicate this malady, they would actually be heavily resisted by a lot of boosters of the New South and people who really, not to put too fine a point on it, were just abject racists. However, Rockefeller did finance a campaign to fight hookworm and try to eradicate it. However, because a lot of these reforms and a lot of these efforts were outside the South and from people who were actually pointing out problems and externalities of the New South's economy, they were dismissed and resisted by a lot of the boosters of the New South who really did want people to believe that there was nothing wrong with the South. The South was booming. Why should it be made to feel bad about any of this other stuff that was clearly at least as they would put it, clearly a product of just laziness. Now, in the case of pellagra, this was yet another disease that was effectively discovered and attempts were made to combat it by outsiders, and these efforts were, of course, resisted by New South boosters, and also to a degree the New South's medical establishment. Now, pellagra is quite interesting because it was a malady that was unique to the South, and really one that had not been heard of prior to 1900. Now, this disease manifested in large rashes in the shape of butterflies on faces and various digestive issues and general melancholia. However, what the Sanitary Commission under Dr. Joseph Goldberger discovered was that pellagra was not a communicable disease. It was, in fact, a disease of sharecroppers, but a disease that they contracted not so much through exposure, but through poor diet. Now, the sharecroppers and tenant farmers, it should go without saying, were quite poor. In fact, because of the debts these people had, they, like poor people throughout history, could not afford a proper diet. And because of this, a lot of what they ate and a lot of their diet was heavy in starches, heavy in pork, and certainly not the sort of pork that we have today that is far healthier than even steak or other meats. It was the worst cuts of pork, lots of starch, and really a diet that bred various vitamin deficiencies. And of course, this is how pellagra came into being. In fact, one of the reasons it was largely unheard of before 1900 was because sharecropping and tenant farming was itself largely novel in the sense that it was something the New South came up with to replace slavery and agricultural labor. Now, efforts to combat pellagra by the Sanitary Commission were resisted by the New South's health establishments, particularly in states like Florida, which even at that point depended heavily on tourism and believed that these outsiders were trying to defame their state and would lead to people not coming to their states out of fear of contracting this disease. Now, with that said, pellagra would peak in terms of cases by the 1920s, and it would gradually decline with improvements in diet and supplements, as well as with the end of sharecropping and tenant farming, which we'll discuss later in the course. Now, while some progressive changes came from without, progressives within the New South did in fact interact with national movements such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, as well as the National Committee to End Child Labor, or the National Child Labor Committee. And in the case of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, there's a very interesting dynamic in terms of interactions between Black and white women and what they tell us about Jim Crow society. Now, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was a biracial organization in the sense that it had Black and white chapters that were largely separate and very similar to the Grange and its Grangers and Black Councils of Labor. However, it is worth noting that the Black middle class in states like North Carolina and in other states in the South where there were strong Black middle class communities, that Black women of the Black middle class tended to have a lot of opportunities to participate in causes like this. In fact, temperance and the push for prohibition really did create a very weird scenario in which the white middle class and Black middle class tended to cooperate. Now, it should go without saying that prohibition had its share of problems. And in the case of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and Black women who saw this as an avenue for participation in society, it's also telling that this was the way that they could participate, because it does reflect the degree to which Jim Crow destroyed Black male citizenship at this point. Now, with that said, there were, of course, other causes that really were mostly attacking various externalities specific to the New South. Among these, child labor and the convict leasing system, things that had been integral to the New South's economy. Now, in the case of child labor, a lot of the rhetoric around outlawing it stemmed from very patriarchal ideals. Now, what I mean by this is, once again, not so much to use patriarchy in the current sense of that term, but an idea that women and children should be protected, usually by a male guardian. And in the case of the New South and its labor regime, child labor really did represent a threat to that, because not only did institutions like cotton mills that employed women and children threaten that sort of patriarchal authority, but ultimately destabilized Southern families. Now, in the case of efforts to expand public education, there was a bit of a similar dynamic to it, but one that I think we can all find a little bit more palatable, namely the expansion of public education to help improve Southern society. Now, child labor and public education saw efforts to really cooperate across ideological lines in the South. In fact, in the case of expanding public education, people who were religious skeptics like Walter Hines Page, who at this point was sort of in and out of the South, he was a Southern expat essentially, and people like the social gospel adherent Edgar Gardner Murphy both worked together to lobby for expanding public schools. Now, public schools in the South are quite interesting. In the Old South, public education was largely non-existent, and it's mainly because public education required taxation, and the people who ran the Old South's state governments were the planters, and they would be voting for taxes for themselves to benefit people who were not planters. Hence, public education was a virtually non-existent thing in the Old South. In the New South, the arrival of Reconstruction did bring public schools, and public schools were actually one of the most popular aspects of Reconstruction, certainly one of the longest lived aspects of it. Now, in the case of these public schools, they tended to mostly be in urban centers, which didn't really do much for rural Southerners who needed it more than anyone. Now, in the case of Page and Murphy, they both lobbied for expanding public education to help benefit rural communities. And it should be noted that public education was, of course, segregated at this point, but people like Murphy, while they didn't resist segregation or really attempt to overturn it, they also did not favor the open racial bigotry of people like Tom Watson, or as we'll talk about later, James K. Vardaman. Now, in the case of education reform in the South, there were also efforts to reform higher education. We can see these in the case of the Southern Association of Colleges and Secondary Schools, formed in 1895 under the leadership of James H. Kirkland, the Chancellor of Vanderbilt University. This organization sought to reform how public universities function in the South, namely by standardizing faculty and hiring practices, and also standardizing scholarship and admission practices. Now, it's not saying that there were no colleges in the South prior to this point, but the colleges that did exist, such as Mississippi, the University of Mississippi, largely served a planter elite, whereas newer land-grant schools did serve a broader clientele, but they also did not necessarily have standardized practices, which certainly put them behind other institutions in the North. Now, alongside efforts to reform education and reform, Southern society overall, there were efforts at ending things like child labor and the convict lease system that did meet some resistance. Now, in the case of the New South, as we have well established, a lot of the New South functioned on cheap labor. And because of this, we see the rise of child labor and the labor of young women in things like textile mills. However, in the case of child labor, the origins of it are a bit interesting and complex. What we typically think of as childhood is largely a recent concept, and it's largely a middle-class concept. To be an adult in American society was largely based on when you could start earning a wage, which, as we see in cotton mills, did not necessarily begin at when we typically pinpoint the beginning of adulthood in a biological sense. Now, in the case of child labor, it also had a very pragmatic basis in mills and particularly mines. Put simply, smaller hands could reach into the recesses of machines more easily than larger ones. Smaller bodies could fit into cramped spaces like mines a lot easier than larger ones. Now, it is worth noting that most people typically view this as pretty bad and nasty work, but ultimately the reason that you see children in these factories and the reason you see young women in these cotton mills is that the economy of the South is a cheap labor economy, meaning that a lot of the patriarchal ideals of the Old South that most certainly continued into the New South weren't really achievable by most members of the population. Now, I mention this because a lot of those ideals really shaped efforts to end child labor. Now, Murphy was also tied to the push to end child labor in the form of the Alabama Child Labor Committee, which he founded, and the National Child Labor Committee that really worked on these issues within and beyond the South. And for Murphy, ending child labor was sort of a part of his broader social gospel principles. Now, the social gospel was a response to social Darwinism, which basically viewed the free market as natural selection and rich people as a higher order of humanity than the poor. There were also undertones of eugenics to social Darwinism, and the social gospel effectively rejected all of this and essentially argued for a fairer society, one that protected women and children and the poor through both political reforms and higher wages and other policies like that facilitated those ends. Now, while the push to end child labor was closely tied to efforts to reform factories and limit the hours of women in textile mills, and really revolved around a mostly patriarchal notion that women and children needed to be protected, the same could not be said for efforts to end the convict leasing system. Now, the convict leasing system, as we've established, was a part of the New South's economy, particularly a part of the rising tide of neo-slavery that replaced the Old South's chattel slavery with various labor regimes like sharecropping, tenant farming, and of course, convict leasing. Now, convict leasing tended to benefit mostly the bourbon elite or the former planters who did not have slaves, but they could, of course, afford to have convicts work their lands. And really, this is something that drove a lot of populists to great anger. Now, I bring up the populists because the person chiefly responsible for ending the convict leasing system in Mississippi is one James K. Vardaman, who very much blurred the lines between populism and progressivism. Now, in the case of Vardaman and his governorship, Vardaman is quite an interesting and problematic figure, to say the least. Now, James K. Vardaman was really quite peculiar in his appearance. He wore his hair quite long. He usually walked around with a cowboy hat and wore all white suits, and had the name the Great White Chief, in part because of his suits, but also because he was a virulent racial demagogue. In fact, when running for governor, he defended lynching outright and routinely used the N-word that ends in ER that I'm not going to repeat. So, a guy who was quite nasty in many respects and very much in the same mold of a Tom Watson, but in many respects he was also quite progressive. He was a teetotaler. In other words, he did not drink at all. And he did oppose child labor, as well as tried to restrict corporations from being able to buy up lots of land in the state for railroads and land speculation. Now, because of his open racism, he was very much at odds with a lot of progressives who, make no mistake, were white supremacists, but they did not necessarily support racial demagoguery and lynching. That said, Vardaman would be one of the state's least corrupt and most progressive governors. In fact, Vardaman, despite his advocacy for lynching, actually used the Mississippi National Guard to stop a lynching. And this is not necessarily because he had a moral epiphany about the evils of lynching and racial equality. It's mainly because he viewed lynching as bad optics for the state of Mississippi. And he also favored more state centric ways of essentially controlling black people. And we can actually see this in his reforms to in the convict lease system and in what he replaces it with, which is the Mississippi State Penitentiary. Now, the penitentiary that he establishes largely resembled a plantation. In fact, it's typically called Parchman Farm or Parchman Prison or just Parchman, and it took on a lot of features of an Old South plantation. Not only did it revolve around primarily agricultural and textile labor, but it was typically comprised of black convicts and white sergeants who would sort of oversee them in ways similar to overseers. Now, one particularly nefarious innovation that Parchman created was the system of armed trustees. Now, when I say armed trustees, these men were not just armed with what we might consider sort of hand-to-hand or sort of blunt force weapons. Some of these trustees actually had firearms. And these trustees would usually be some of the most violent prisoners in Parchman. And if they shot prisoners who were fleeing and trying to escape Parchman, they could basically get themselves a pardon. So Parchman Penitentiary or Parchman Prison or the Mississippi State Penitentiary was actually quite a nefarious institution. But if we think about it in the context of progressive reform, not so much as benign reform, but sort of making society more efficient, it does fall into that mold in the darkest sort of way. Because what Parchman represented was a system of state race control that effectively replaced this older regime of privatized and quasi-privatized race control, as U.B. Phillips would call it, in the form of convict leasing and in the form of earlier chattel slavery. Now, in the case of Vardaman himself, because he alienated himself from a lot of the Southern bourbon establishment in Mississippi, he was politically not that effective. He would see reforms that restricted corporate land ownership and reforms to child labor, but ultimately Vardaman's influence would be pretty non-existent. And ultimately, by the First World War, it would be non-existent because he would be challenged by a pro-Wilson primary challenger. Now, we'll talk a bit more about Vardaman and the Wilson administration in the next lecture, but again, just keep that in mind. With all of this said, what was progressivism? And what was it in the context of the New South? Ultimately, progressivism, whether in the South or beyond, was a reform movement or a reform moment in the context of the U.S. and in the context of the New South. In the case of the New South, we can see progressive efforts to reform society in figures like Booker T. Washington and institutions like Tuskegee, which sought to essentially reform the Black South in the mold of Washington himself. And we also see progressive reform in cases like educational reform and to a degree health reform, although in the case of health, as noted, Southern progressivism had its limits, and this progressivism, because of its origin, was heavily resisted. Now, like the populists, progressive reformers were very classist in their orientation. Because they were middle class reformers, they favored more moderate changes to Southern society, and for that matter, American society, than, say, the populists. And it's in this context that we can understand why progressivism did not necessarily see an overturning of Jim Crow, but rather a transformation of it. Again, if we think of our friend Vardaman, who we just talked about, Vardaman, despite his rhetoric and despite what other progressives thought of him, was very much in the progressive mold because what he was doing with the convict leasing system and the creation of the Mississippi State Penitentiary. All of what they sought to do tended to be to either reform or standardize aspects of Southern society that were not standardized and that sort of lent themselves to social ills or inequities. And again, this is sort of the problem with progressivism and why progressivism is somewhat morally gray. Yes, progressivism had some good aspects to it. Again, we can all sort of agree that abolishing child labor and reforming education were very noble goals. But the ultimate issue with progressivism is that reform is where it began and ended. Ultimately, the progressives were comfortable with the New South as they reformed it. They did not address many of the main issues of the New South, such as its foundations in white supremacy, or for that matter, its foundations in cheap labor. Effectively, what they sought to do was simply to reform it and legislate some of these issues away, but not really fundamentally change them. Now, one of the interesting things about progressivism in the South is that, as we'll talk about in the next lecture, progressivism actually had a very long career in the New South. While historians typically pinpoint the end of progressivism with the end of the First World War, progressivism in the South actually continued well into the 1920s. But with that said, that will be the subject of our next lecture. And on that note, this is Dr. Davis signing off.